Anniversaries routinely concentrate the mind, and there is much to deliberate as India assumes the chairmanships of the G20 and SCO. The former is scheduled for September 2023, whereas at the time of writing, no date is fixed for the latter. This second annual security dialogue, co-hosted through the good offices of Mr. Pandya's Usanis Foundation and the Indian Ministry of External Affairs, affords an opportunity not just to reflect, but recall Churchill that the further back you look, the further forward you can see. At least for the historian as I, who also derives comfort from George Orwell in these, what are truly Orwellian times, that a restatement of the obvious is the first duty of intelligent men everywhere. I hope to practice what I preach during the next 15 minutes. I hasten to assure that it will not be a sonorous, potted romp of events and personalities. At least I think not, and that my selective interventions repay consideration. So to the regional challenges faced by the Indian Republic 75 years on, and an overview. Partition was, insofar as I'm concerned, the only way out of that impasse. That the British wanted a united India is now amply attested in declassified documents and a more detailed reading of historical sources. The divide and rule trope, long a mainstay of nationalist readings, is simply untenable. What may have been pursued during the imperial era was ill-suited to London's post-war priorities, for in an united India, it envisaged a communist bulwark, access to an effective army which had only recently distinguished itself as the largest voluntary military force in the 39-45 war, and could be counted on to stabilize the Persian Gulf and Southeast Asia, a Commonwealth market for resources and finished goods in the Sterling area, and transit point to the empire's far-flung reaches, namely Australasia. Partition upended all that, but it was necessary to break the deadlock between both political factions. It became quite rightly clear to Congress to divest a portion of the Muslim majority regions to pursue effective governance. And the Hindu Mahasabha was correct in forcing Congress's hand in calling for a division of the provinces of Bengal and Punjab rather than relegate the status and security of all non-Muslims, not just Hindus, to fate, as Muslims would always be first among equals in an Islamic setting. Note also, for we often forget, that the 1946 Cabinet Mission Plan was acceptable to Jinnah because it contained a nascent Pakistan, which, a decade on, come 1957, was permitted to secede from the Indian Union. Just how was Nehru's India to bank upon the fealty or fickleness of those who could hold Indian unity and development hostage is never discussed by those who blame him for accepting partition at the behest of the Hindu Mahasabha. And the Muslim majority zones could decadally review if they wish to continue being part of India. Exactly how was India to function as this perpetually Damoclean sword loomed large, and merits noting, for nowhere in contemporary discussions does one find this salient feature invoked to remind both Indians and Pakistanis, especially the former, who have now become the fifth largest global economy. As for Jinnah and the canker of Indo-Pakistan relations, Kashmir, the following must be enumerated. On all three visits to the princely kingdom, 1926, 36, and 44, Jinnah expressed no interest in the region. That there was a groundswell of Muslim political consciousness there, as elsewhere for the Pakistan movement by the mid-40s, is not disputed. But Jinnah was reticent to actively cultivate the Muslim conference, as he did with other regional parties elsewhere across the Indian Empire's provinces. Time does not permit me to trace the antecedents of this kingdom, and the advent of Dogra dynastic rule with an intact Rajput genealogy drawn up with a little British cooperation by the March 1846 Treaty of Amritsar to establish their sway in this vast northern expanse of the subcontinent. Nor is it possible to contextualize this through theories of modernity and state formation. And there is a very banal reason for this. It is difficult to talk of it, quote, since there is no nation state to institutionalize the narrative of Kashmiri nationalism. Kashmiris have a fragile identity, as Nasreen Ali, British Pakistani academic in England, put it, because they lack an institutional panoply that would establish Kashmir and have failed to articulate a collective national identity because of the contested and divided nature of Kashmir, close quote. The rest, with the onset of the jihadists entering the kingdom and the First Indo-Pakistan War of October 47, is familiar fare. It established a mainstay of Pakistani civilian-military relations, which played itself out subsequently. Had Liaquat Ali Khan not been assassinated, he would have been ousted by Pakistan's first successful coup of 1951, not 1958, with Major Akbar Khan, organizer of the Pashtun jihadist Kashmir raiders, assuming the office of state. Nawaz Sharif came begging to Bill Clinton in July 1999, seeking an honorable exit from Kargil and to save his skin for the military. General Musharraf, recently deceased, struck back 3 months later, October 1999. But what of that much-touted plebiscite and clamour for Kashmiri self-determination? Mountbatten flew to Lahore to discuss this with Jinnah on 1st November 1947. Jinnah, ladies and gentlemen, refused to entertain a plebiscite on the question of the Kingdom of Kashmir. He ruled it out, and Pakistanis would do well to respect their Quaid-e-Azam's wishes. The United Nations Commission for India and Pakistan, UNCIP, resolution of August 1948, and the principles of plebiscite, which were formally accepted by Pakistan in December 1948, demanded prior withdrawal of Pakistani forces for holding just such a plebiscite. A distinct obligation was expected of both warring parties. Pakistan was urged to withdraw completely, whereas India was under instruction to retain some security personnel to deploy a quantum of force on ground to assist local authorities in keeping the peace. Joseph Corbell, mentor to two American state secretaries, Madeleine Albright and Condoleezza Rice, explained at length to Nehru that the UN's principles of plebiscite does not recognize either the Azad Kashmir government or so-called Azad forces. India's de jure position on the accession of the princely state was upheld by the United Nations. Not for nothing did Pakistan never mention the plebiscite in UN Security Council Resolution 211 following the Second Indo-Pak War of 1965 and Resolution 311 after the Third Indo-Pak War of 1971 or the similar agreement the following year. But most tellingly, it is the legal principle of rebus sic stantibus which clinches the Indian case. For international law maintains and provides for one party to be exonerated from a prior undertaking or obligation if there is a vital change in circumstances existing at the time of the obligation was undertaken. Material circumstances have altered considerably since 1947, which prevent India from exercising a commitment it held out in the first instance. Pakistan forced India to renege holding just such a plebiscite. It goes naturally to explain Nehru's address to the Indian Parliament, 27th November 1963, some months before his death, when he clarified, Article 370 is, quote, part of certain transitional provisional arrangements. It is not a permanent part of the Constitution. It is a part so long as it remains so, close quote. Rehearsing to what that percipient Pakistani, Hussein Haqqani, is what a Pakistan at 75 needs to be retold about the diminishing significance of the Kashmir is vital for Pakistan's economic survival hobby horse, which at least in the late 1940s and throughout the 50s was posited as the need to merge it with Pakistan. This is not to set any store now because Haqqani explains, quote, there has been no threat to the flow of river water into Pakistan despite Indian control of Kashmir, nor has the lack of access to the state's resources impeded Pakistan's economic growth. On the contrary, the case can now be made that the cost of pursuing the claim over Kashmir, especially through ever-increasing military expenditure, far exceeds any economic benefits Pakistan might get by extending its sovereignty over all of Kashmir, close quote. Sovereignty, and particularly that vexing question of water bodies, watersheds, brings me to the Sino-Indian imbroglio. My remarks here are restricted to Aksai Chin, which is tied up with Kashmir and the imperial defense of the subcontinent from Tsarist Russia. Be that as it may, it is plain London never defined it, unlike the McMahon Line and that contentious demarcation along the Assam Himalayas. The British infrequently made some claim to this wasteland, but from 1880 onwards did nothing to or bother to enforce their writ. Only an 1899 note can be adduced wherein Calcutta waived any claim to it. A clarification is in order as regards the Dogra dynasts, rulers of Kashmir since 1846, whose suzerainty never ever stretched all the way into Chinese Turkestan, today's Khotan prefecture in Xinjiang. What the then ruler did was dispatch in 1865 across the Karakoram Pass a small contingent to Shahidullah, a caravan halting place and garrison located on the lower bank of the Karakash River. 25 Kashmiri state soldiers were stationed here along 50 Kyrgyz nomads for additional support, merely to check marauders from Hunza, plundering and slaying traders who traversed between Leh and Yarkand. The Dogras abandoned Shahidullah 2 years later in 1867. The Chinese formally opened National Highway 219 from Kashgar via Aksai Chin to Tibet in October 1957. Indian intelligence had already apprised New Delhi of Khotan to Gargunza mule convoys in late 1951, and again in a November 1955 report by one Brigadier Malik. A decade earlier, in fact during the war years, 1940 to 41, the Soviets had assisted the then Republican Chinese government to conduct a survey of those districts of Xinjiang bordering Ladakh. Those Soviet forays into mineral-rich Xinjiang were unbeknown to the British authorities, as pointed out by the late Karunakar Gupta. And those topographical maps published displayed the Karakoram Mountains as a natural frontier of the Dogra Kingdom, with Aksai Chin lying northeast. What started as a spat about Aksai Chin eventually led to a disastrous and entirely unavoidable war thousands of miles away at the other extremity of northeast India. Much has been said about Zhou Enlai's last trip to India in April 1960, where he proposed an Indian recognition of Chinese sovereignty over Aksai Chin in lieu of adjustments along the northeast frontier tract, today's Arunachal Pradesh. Zhou Enlai had even written to Nehru a year earlier, in January 1959, declaring a Chinese fait accompli of the McMahon Line, thus making a concession in the northeast for Aksai Chin, which was non-negotiable, given the annexation of Tibet in October 1950 and its geostrategic imperatives. The Chinese had reconciled themselves to the McMahon Line in the era before and following independence in 1947, and what had started with the British conquest of Assam following their victory in the First Burmese War of 1826. If politics is the art of the possible, then one can say that Nehru's India not only overstated its case on a purely legalist moralist plank, which found accommodating Chinese objections intolerable. But what of the optics? The natural frontier remains fixed and the McMahon Line is not going anywhere. China tacitly recognized that when it came to
please wind up.
Its border in 1960, when Beijing relinquished claims over parts of Upper Burma's fertile Irrawaddy water region. Chinese skullduggery, however, in manipulating Tajikistan and Kyrgyzstan to force weaker states to divest territory must be pointed out, lest one infers that the present writer is sanguine and regrets what might have been achieved a century ago. 2 points before I conclude. It is time Indian historians particularly, and Indians generally, still psychologically smarting from the tragedy of 1962, realize that what ensued in those fateful weeks of October-November 62 must also be refracted from the Cold War prism and the fast deteriorating Sino-Soviet ideological split after 1955-56. Mao was mounting an attack on Khrushchev via Nehru, which is a fact often lost on Indians. And in March 1969, he did just that during that brief Sino-Soviet war along the Ussuri River in Siberia. In his November 1986 state visit to India, Gorbachev made it plain that Moscow could not be counted upon during any future Sino-Indian showdown. Come 1987, Gorbachev seized the initiative to break the stalemate of the past 2 decades and took up the Chinese on negotiations leading to the first demarcation settlement in 1991, and both parties finally resolved all issues by 2003, including an additional protocol in 2008. Xi Jinping has not been half as voluble as Putin about India's decision to join the Quad, given that the latter had pushed for full Indian membership in the SCO. It is time India distanced itself from both, especially that toxic defense dependency partnership with Russia, which thinks nothing of conducting joint military exercises since 2016 with Pakistan. The 5th in that series just concluded in November 2020. The next 75 years, ladies and gentlemen, hold promise as India deepens its ties with Canberra, Tokyo, and Washington. And may this come not a day sooner. Thank you.